Mrs. Johnson seconded Newt Gingrich's nomination, calling him the most visionary thinker in American politics today. Took a year and a half to get those charges out of the committee, out of the place where there were the conflicts of interest, and into the hands of an independent counsel. And here we sit today. The integrity of Congress is at issue. And I would like to also add that the power of the chair is not nearly so important of the chair of the committees in Congress as the voice of the people in the district. And that is the voice that needs to be changed with term limits.
First of all, that just isn't true. Chairman Dingell kept the Clean Water Act off the Congress's agenda for 10 years because he was chairman. And in terms of the Ethics Committee and conflict of interest, I was a founder of the moderate group that is a thorn in the Speaker's side day in and day out.
What difference did it make in the agenda?
Well, absolutely. It won on environmental issues. It won on family planning, and so on and so forth.
It won on family planning?
Absolutely. You bet it did. But what I wanted to make clear is it's interesting that my opponent never mentions the fact that we had the Gephardt case, the minority leader of the Democrats, before us for a year. Mr. McDermott, my ranking Democrat, is a very close friend of the Minority Leader Gephardt, talks with him all the time on the floor, and no allegations were raised there. The members of the Ethics Committee are senior members. We know all the members on both sides well, and if you were going to charge conflict of interest, you would have to charge it against all 5 Democrats and all 5 Republicans.
Okay,
but this election is not about Newt. This election is about my record on behalf of the people I represent.
Let's talk a bit more about that. And Charlotte, let me ask you a question in terms of this whole trade situation and the NAFTA and GATT kind of proposals, where perhaps a great deal has not been said about this on the national level by the presidential candidates, at least to the degree that a lot of people would like to hear it. And the question is, I guess, you know, are these good trade agreements, or do we have to start trying to keep a lot of these jobs back in this country, not let them go overseas or to Mexico or someplace else?
Well, I think that the trade agreements are very unfinished. NAFTA has, we have problems with trucks coming from Mexico that don't have the proper kind of safety inspection. We have, there's a lot still to come in about Mexico and NAFTA. Just because this is a global economy doesn't mean we have to be a nation of victims. We certainly should have done a better job at protecting our jobs with these agreements.
If an opportunity came up in the Congress in the next few years to do away with those agreements, how would you stand on them? Is the jury still out as far as you're concerned?
I think the jury is definitely still out.
Congresswoman Johnson?
I think that's very short-sighted. And just as my opponent's stand on welfare reform, because she would not have supported welfare reform, fails to deal with the challenge of the future in our nation. I mean, welfare reform needed to be welfare needed to be changed to involve people in creating their own future and empower them. In the same way, trade policy has to open new markets for American goods. We are a stagnant market. We are not growing rapidly as a population. We are aging as a population. And if you want good-paying jobs, and if you want career opportunities for your kids, you have to have more and more places to sell American goods. And that's what these trade agreements were about. And that NAFTA agreement actually had a 62% domestic content requirement in it. The first trade agreement ever to have that in there, so that American manufactured parts would have preference over Asian manufactured parts. And since we're the biggest manufacturers of parts, we win in that deal.
A couple of minutes left. Charlotte, comment on the welfare reform and your feelings about that.
Okay, welfare reform really shows people who have courage. Everybody understands that welfare needed to be reformed, that the AFDC program facilitated the kind of dependency that we know is wrong. This bill didn't do it. I have the courage to say it. I know it's unpopular because Mrs. Johnson brings it up every single time that we are together. The fact of the matter is that that bill does not have enough training money in it. It's $13 billion short of training money to get people from jobs to work. We must reform welfare, absolutely. I look forward to making that bill better in the next Congress. Some of the good things in the bill, requiring teenage parents to live in a supervised setting, very good. Requiring welfare recipients to get substance abuse training, all of that is very good. I support that, but I would have held out for a better bill, and I wouldn't have been afraid to take the political risk and do that.
Does that bill need work, Congresswoman?
We increased money for daycare. We increased money for adult education. We increased money for substance abuse treatment, and we gave a 25% increase in the social service money that cities like Hartford and New Britain get. so that they will have the resources to fill in holes, but as they see them for their own people. So they can put it into job training, they can put it into transportation, they can put it into off-hour daycare. I mean, we have put the resources there. The Ways and Means Committee will oversee that legislation carefully, and if we need more resources, we'll give it. But the bottom line is, America can't keep paying people to not work.
Okay, thanks. I'm afraid our time is up. Nancy Johnson, Republican, Charlotte Koskof, Democrat. Thank you so much for being with us on our portion of our program. Back with more our Issues Check in just a moment. And welcome back to Connecticut Newsmakers. Only days remain in this presidential campaign. That means during this portion of the program, it's time for Issues Check. A look at two of the major issues in the campaign, foreign policy and the character issue / also talking about campaign finance reform. For the past few months, Connecticut News 30 has been joining forces with the Hartford Courant about the major issues in this presidential campaign. Every Monday, the Courant features a story on an important issue, and we talk about it in length on Connecticut Newsmakers. We'll start this morning on the foreign policy issue. With me today is Nancy Schoeffler, the Assistant Government Affairs Editor for the Hartford Courant, along with Republican State Treasurer Christopher Burnham, representing the Dole-Kemp campaign today. And on my far left is Donnie Fowler Jr., who's been the campaign director for the Clinton-Gore effort here in the state of Connecticut. Nancy, begin. First of all, in terms of what the paper did in your stories on foreign policy, in a nutshell, what do the voters think about this?
Well, we're not looking so much at the voters in these stories as what the candidates themselves have been saying. And clearly, both in the presidential race and in the congressional races we've got going on in Connecticut, foreign policy is sort of low on the list of issues. Bob Dole, of course, has criticized President Clinton for his photo op foreign policy and for an ad hoc decision-making and a real muddled leadership style, but the president's supporters say that it's a different world. The issues are not as clear-cut as they were in the Cold War days.
Why don't you fire out and get a question of these gentlemen on that?
How should the candidates decide how to prioritize what our national interests are, where the threats lie?
Well, Nancy, we can't go back to an isolationist nation. And we can't let a campaign reflect that either. Clearly, there were some monumental failures in the Clinton administration in terms of foreign policy. Clearly, there's been the absence of a dynamic direction within foreign policy. And we see not only the latest bit in the press this week about additional troops needed in Bosnia going well past 1997, perhaps into 1998. We see perhaps a continuing entanglement in Bosnia. You know, we're still, I think, smarting in the veteran community from the deaths, the 18 Rangers who died in Mogadishu, on the streets of Mogadishu. So there's no real direction there. But those, I think, are micro issues. The macro or larger picture here is how are we going to handle a Russia that is imploding? How are we going to handle a China that takes over Hong Kong next July, wants to take over Taiwan, and meanwhile continues to sell nuclear facilities, not armaments, but nuclear fissionable producing technology to people like Pakistan or India or other places.
So how would you answer those questions? I mean, these are the questions. How would the candidate...
Well, let's go back to Christopher. Donnie, why don't you pick up on that first?
Well, I think the success of the foreign policy has been demonstrated by Bob Dole's support for much of what President Clinton has done, from the decision to send troops to Bosnia, the Middle East peace process, one of the most successful peace agreements in the Middle East. It's fragile. The peace process in Northern Ireland, the success we've had in the democratic elections in Haiti. We have democracy in Bosnia. Bob Dole supported President Clinton on all of these issues, and I think what you see is a real bipartisan effort on behalf of President Clinton, supported by Senator Dole. I think what we're seeing is a lot of togetherness, a situation where there's not a whole lot of difference between the candidates on foreign policy. They both have a very successful career. The president is 4 years as president, Bob Dole 35 years in Congress, but they both, I think, stand for a lot of the same things, and That's how do we keep peace in the world, and how do we promote the American economy in the world? And I think they both agree in a lot of ways.
Bringing it back to Connecticut, which is a big export state, a lot of people wonder, perhaps one of the issues that was the most controversial in our survey was how to balance China and our desire to trade and boost trade with China with concerns about human rights. And I wondered how would President Clinton or President Dole balance those questions?
Well, that's obviously the challenge. I won't say that I'm very well versed in our policy toward China, but it's a challenge not only with China and how do we balance human rights issues, promote democracy, while still benefiting America's economic and foreign policy interests.
It's a very difficult question, and it's difficult particularly when in a campaign, I think Clinton just gave his first foreign policy speech last week. So with all due respect to the president really has to lead the way. Congress doesn't lead the way on foreign policy. The president makes foreign policy. So he has to demonstrate that clear vision. Now, I think that the Congress should be very supportive and should be very bipartisan in that effort, and I think Bob Dole has demonstrated clear support for the president. But the president has shown an absence of leadership in terms of dealing with these things. Now, specifically in China, I just got back from China last month, and I was meeting with the governor of Guangdong province. This is a province just off of Hong Kong and the mainland. 66 million people live in an area really about the size of Hartford County. The numbers over there are staggering. You know, the governor told me our first priority is feeding, $1.2 billion. Our next is housing, $1.2 billion. Our next is employing, $1.2 billion. And then we want to clothe them and educate them. So he said, you Americans come over here and you say, well, human rights should be our top priority, and yet we worry about feeding 1.2 billion people. And the governor of Guangdong worries about feeding 66 million people in his province. So it's difficult for us as Americans to superimpose our American standards on China.
Let me take a quick break here, and then we'll come back with more on this portion of the program. Be right back. Welcome back. More on our issues check, and now we're talking about the character issue and also talking about the whole business of financing political campaigns. Nancy, what's happening here?
Well, I was trying to think of a linkage between foreign policy and campaign finance reform, and this past week, in the past days, we've definitely seen that in the election with so much static over contributions from foreign companies, and literally in both presidential campaigns, candidates coming under fire for that. But this past session in Congress, an effort to ban political action committees and provide incentives for candidates who voluntarily accept spending limits failed. It was the fourth failure for a campaign finance reform proposal in the last decade. I wonder how the candidates, do you think that the election season with so much discussion of campaign financing, is this going to re-energize chances for some sort of reform in the coming session?
Donnie, start, please.
I hope so. The President and the Democratic Party, broadly speaking, support all kinds of campaign finance reform. And we need to eliminate soft money from federal elections. We need to improve the disclosure laws so that everybody gets a better idea of what money is being spent and where it's being spent. We need to encourage the media, particularly television, to provide free airtime so that the candidates don't have to fight so hard for this money, because most of the money goes into your media buys. So the President and the Democratic Party have been out front. This is the agenda that they want to establish. This is the kind of legislation that they want to pass. And in fact, we had a good start June of '95 when Newt Gingrich and President Clinton were in New Hampshire. They shook hands. They said, here's how we work on a bipartisan way for campaign finance reform. They agreed to establish a commission. The President appointed his commissioners. Newt Gingrich, with the backing of Senator Dole and the other Republicans, refused to appoint commissioners. In effect, Newt Gingrich made an agreement that he backed off on. So, but I think campaign finance reform is a very tricky issue in a partisan fashion. But it's clear, I think, in a bipartisan nature, less soft money, some free media time, better disclosure laws, that's what's going to do good for campaign finance reform.
I think you're right, Nancy. I think the disaster that's happening at the Democratic National Committee today with the John Huang fiasco, the Indonesia money, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that's flooded in from Malaysia and Indonesia in the last few months into the Clinton campaign, I think has caught America's umbrage, that I think Americans are upset. And I think that, you know, Donnie is right in saying that this is a bipartisan, it needs to be a bipartisan effort, but it's also a bipartisan blame here. The Democrats were in control of the Congress for 40 years. They elected a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. They held the Congress for 2 years. They did nothing in that 2-year period while holding a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president. If ever there was an opportunity for a president to lead the way, it was then, and yet they failed. We won the Congress in 1994, and there was the McCain bill that tried to get out. It failed. I think that Don is right, that we're going to have to put this in a bipartisan effort. And politicians are going to have to step up to the plate and say, I'm going to lead the way. I'm going to be the first. I'll put in a plug for myself. We banned all political contributions to the Treasury, to treasurer's races last year for people who do business with the treasurer's office, because we want to invest the people's money based on merit, not based on political contacts. And I think that the Congress and Senator Dodd and others and the President have to lead the way on this thing. We have to show the example.
We have about 3 minutes left. Donnie, let me ask you a quick question. Chris, pick up on it. In terms of the whole character thing, I mean, some people say, look, we don't care what's in somebody's past as long as they do the job, whether it be president, the U.S. Senator, or anything else. Other people say that, particularly if you're going for the presidency, you have to be above everybody else, that the character is important. How do you respond to that, Donnie?
Well, I think every public opinion poll demonstrates that most Americans believe President Clinton has the will, the character, the integrity to be president. The character issue is an interesting topic, but in fact, what Americans care about is what matters to them is what do they think about when they wake up in the morning. A good job, good wage, their pension is secure, their parents' Medicare and Medicaid are secure, their kids are going to be safe at school, their kids are going to be safe when they come home from school. So I think the American people in all kinds of polls believe that President Clinton has the integrity and the will and the energy, the right kind of energy to be president. But what they care about is what matters when they wake up in the morning.
Okay, Chris, pick up.
Well, I think that the polls clearly show, at least the ones that I'm reading, that the people don't believe Clinton has the character, a lot of integrity. But the amazing phenomena is that people don't seem to care. And I don't know why that is, because it's so important to me as someone who is dedicating my career to public service, that we have the very top people in America serving in the leadership of America. People who aren't lying about Whitewater, people who aren't lying about Casa Grande, people who aren't ready to pardon individuals in their administration so that they don't implicate the president, people who aren't lying about Indonesian money flooding into a campaign. I mean, it's just, I think that we're going to have an ethics meltdown in a second Clinton White House if that is, in fact, what happens on November 5th.
Okay, another one.
And I just quote one thing, the New York Times. The New York Times had an editorial last year, ethics meltdown at the White House. And I think we are going to be in bad shape in this country unless the Clinton administration reverses its lack.